Thanks, everyone. So let's set the stage. We're in Silicon Valley circa 2014. What's broken between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley? Let's sort of give people the raison d'etre for DIUX. I know you weren't first generation, but what was the relationship between the Valley a decade ago?
I think it was a really tough time a decade ago between the Valley and the Pentagon. If you think back, this is when the Snowden revelations had occurred, so immense amount of mistrust between large tech companies and our national security apparatus. It was also a time where it was just really hard to do business with the government. An average contract would take 4 years. And if you're a startup or a young company that has to raise capital every 18 to 24 months, the timelines didn't work. And so the investors were recommending their companies not to work. And then I think culturally, if you think about it, over the last 30 years, the U.S. military has shuttered every active duty base in the Bay Area region, right? We used to have 2 aircraft carriers parked here in Alameda. Now there are no active duty bases. And so there wasn't that human interaction and understanding. So I think the gulf had been growing over the years.
Yeah. At that time, Ash Carter was the Secretary of Defense. Did he have an agenda that didn't have a lot to do with Silicon Valley, that was about this contracting process that he was dealing with his major
Well, he had a very searing experience when he first settled into his first role in the Obama administration as the head of the Pentagon's acquisition office. And this is at the height of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there was a huge focus on getting MRAPs, the armored vehicles that could better protect troops against IEDs, fielded. And so he was the one that was the driving force behind accelerating this massive and emergency acquisition program going forward. And it taught him how broken the system was. But Ash Carter, it was a real privilege for Raj and I to work with someone like that, because he did not miss much. And one of the things that he already identified as early as 2001 in an article that he wrote when he was a Harvard professor, saying, "Keep the technological edge," that was the title of the article, that the trends were really shifting. And subtly but persistently, in the sense that it used to be in the Cold War that government R&D labs were way far ahead of consumer technology, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations ahead. But at the end of the Cold War, R&D budgets flatlined, and the commercial technology economy took off to the point that when we arrive on scene in Silicon Valley in 2015 and 2016, companies like Apple have more value, larger market caps than the entire defense industrial base combined, which is remarkable. That tells you, as Ash Carter pointed out in 2001, that the locus of innovation was shifting towards the commercial world, and the Pentagon would have to change how it thinks about where it gets technology if it wants to stay competitive.
Yeah. But same token, you guys were not the first generation of DIUX. I get the sense that you were brought in to fix an organization that was supposed to fix a broken relationship, which was broken itself. Can you tell that story? I mean, you were the fix-it guys, right?
Sure. Yeah. So Secretary Carter had come to visit the Valley, I guess about 6 months before we joined. First sitting Secretary of Defense to come in 20 years, and announced his vision. Unfortunately, it was staffed down into lower levels of the Pentagon, where they didn't share the same level of energy, perhaps, for this idea that Secretary Carter was. And I think one of the things you learn about bureaucracy is that you can die from 1,000 cuts that are small, and each individual one maybe not so bad. So that first team was just not set up for success. They were working on literally folding, IKEA tables. Yeah. They had hotspots for internet.
Why didn't they get Wi-Fi? How could any organization at this point in time not give?
That's our view on it, right? Okay. We could just call Comcast, but no, you have to call the Pentagon acquisition group. Someone's got to build some requirement and send it, and you're going through the same process. Yeah. And so, look, I think he again credits to Secretary Carter that said, "Look, my current system is not working. and no fault to the current guys, they weren't set up for success. This is really important. I'm going to own it, right? A typical, government act would be just let me just bury it, hide it. No one's going to know about it. He said, no, I'm going to change it. I'm going to bring in a new team. There was 4 of us that joined, and most importantly, he gave us a set of authorities that no one else had. It ranged from, okay, we're going to report directly to him. That's a pretty big deal. The good news about a bureaucracy is, even though there's so many bureaucrats, if the top guy says jump, everybody jumps. He gave us a whole set of authorities, from owning our budget to hire and fire authority, but most importantly, we had the authority to have an exception to policy to any rule or regulation that got in our way. And again, his bully pulpit. And so we relaunched, and we were given the right sorts of capabilities. But most importantly, we had a team that not was just from the Valley, but of the Valley. So, I had been there and had built a company. We had a couple other Silicon Valley types. We had Chris, who really understood the department. The job was too big for any one individual. So it took all of us in our skill sets to say, okay, how do we actually go and execute and build something, new, where we had to overcome those things you're talking about. Even my own first company, right, was a couple of engineers from the National Security Agency. And our investors told us, stop taking meetings with the government.
And how did Ash Carter find you himself, or how did you guys get found?
We met each other in Washington circles and started talking about this opportunity out here in Silicon Valley. And I got a chance to work on the original concept for the office. And then at some point, when it was clear the office was struggling, I was told by the Secretary of Defense that I would be moving to California with Raj. And this was a problem because I owned 5 suits, a lot of ties, and only 1 pair of jeans. So I had to go out and buy some jeans. But it was incredibly thrilling to come out with that level of commitment from a sitting Secretary of Defense and to do our very best to go after some of the hardest problems that the department had not yet cracked that were getting in the way of what was possible in the relationship.
Don, maybe I'll add to that. I think one of the themes you'll see and why we kind of wrote this book is that there were a lot of heroes. There were a lot of individuals that could make a real difference. And I think, again, that's the theme, that even in a 3 million person bureaucracy, individuals can really move the ball forward. So there was someone named Todd Park, who was the CTO of the United States. And, candidly, I kind of wasn't really looking forward to getting back into government service. I had, ideas to continue being an entrepreneur. And they basically sent Todd out to come sit with you. And he is, this day, probably the most convincing and charismatic individual like I've ever met, and basically took all of the folks that said no and turned us into yeses, and was passionate about it.
There's another interesting aspect of the way you guys came out to take this over. I mean, in the Pentagon world, I imagine co-CEOs are not a thing at all. And it's not even that big of a thing out in Silicon Valley. I mean, usually leadership is not thought of as a collaborative effort as a rule. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, the way that we thought about it, again, because of these various things that these difficult problems we had to solve, we had 4 of us in a partnership. It is still a government organization, so they had to have one neck to squeeze, which was me. So first among equals, if you will. But we tried to be less hierarchical because we were creating, right? We inherited, 9 people, and we left with about 100 at the end of our tenure. And so we try to bring different models.
Yeah. So I reread your book over the weekend, and I have to say there's some fun stories. There's some interesting stories. There's some stories that raised my eyebrows. There was some stuff that I thought, isn't this stuff still classified? There's an interesting story I commend you all about a Google car accident that has not been reported publicly. We'll let you read the book to get at that. But I wanted to ask about the story that opens the book, about your decision to go to commercial off-the-shelf technology to deal with a problem you had as an F-16 fighter pilot, which was how to find the border between, I guess, Afghanistan and Iran. Was that it? How big a deal was that inside inside the military at that point to do something like that?
So, Don, so in 2006, I was a young captain on my first deployment. I was an F-16 pilot in the U.S. Air Force to Iraq. My mission was to support ground troops all over Iraq, but oftentimes on the borders of Iran and Iraq. F-16 is an amazing airplane, highly maneuverable, just a sheer joy to fly. We had a GPS, of course, but I didn't have a moving map. I couldn't look down at a screen and just, at 500 miles an hour tell you which side of the border you were on. And if you get it wrong, maybe you create an international incident, but, or God forbid, the general finds out and sends you home, right? Which is like the worst. And so, but that same year, right, I could get the predecessor to an iPad, a compact iPad, put in a $100 piece of commercial software and know where it was. And, we were in a single seat fighter, so a lot of folks would just fly with them on your knee in the cockpit. But it was a real telling sign of how divergent software in particular, but how divergent modern technology and the speed had gone from the commercial world to the military world. And our system of acquiring and maintaining and building technology was a good one, but for a different era and not built for the software era.
Yeah. But you were able to get away with it. I mean, it was a hack, right? But very Silicon Valley style.
Sure.
Yeah.
And people always ask, is the Pentagon or is the military innovative? And I would say and this was actually a quote that Bob Work, the Deputy Secretary, used to say, is that the Pentagon doesn't have an innovation problem. It has an innovation adoption problem. So you go across any branch, right, any group, and some of the most innovative people are in the field, and they're going to do the best with whatever kit you've given them. And the real innovation problems lies in nameless cubicles where people are unwilling to take tough career decisions. So I was not alone across the war of people just taking whatever they had and trying to do as good a job as they could.
So let's focus on that innovation question, because I have to say, I thought you have the cover of your book is great, and the heart is this contradiction between the iPhone and the F-35 fighter. But I know enough about the history of the iPhone, and in particular, I want to commend to you a book by an economist by the name of Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote a book where the title is The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public and Private Sector Myths. And her point in there is almost every technology, if not every technology in the iPhone, came out of military R&D. And so there's a bit of nuance to this dichotomy between the commercial off-the-shelf stuff and the military stuff that makes it a more subtle question than just sort of making a left turn. And I don't know quite how to pick that apart, but if you look at, you can look broadly across Silicon Valley and you will find DoD, largely DARPA funding underneath every innovation. And so the question of innovation becomes super interesting because it's not just, there's something else going on here, I think. And I wonder if you guys have thoughts about that.
Well, we wrestled with excavating that history for our own team. And we had a number of speakers actually early in DIU's days. We had Vint Cerf come by to talk about his work at DARPA. We had a number of other authors who come. So you're right, there is this much deeper and more fascinating history that does show the interplay of these technologies. But at the end of the day, that iPhone was being sold, at Apple stores for people to play with. And the incredible technology in that phone was not being used by the military. And on the cover of the book, we have these two images, that of the iPhone and that of the F-35, the most advanced fighter. Raj, who flies F-16, doesn't like it when I say that. And the F-35, its design was frozen in 2001 when the production contract went to Lockheed Martin. The F-35 didn't become fully operational until 2016. A lot had changed in technology since then. So the vision that Ash Carter had for a Defense Innovation Unit was to try and bring these two completely separate methodologies for building technology much closer together.
Yeah. But that brings us to another important sort of contradictory issue here. So there's this COTS technology that moves very quickly and has become very powerful. I used to describe it when I saw the same thing that you guys realized sometime in the 1990s. The transition you're talking about is the companies that made the world's fastest computers all of a sudden were the companies that made things that went under Christmas trees. And that was this turnover from technology trickling down to trickling up. And clearly everything changed. The problem from a military point of view that I'd like to ask you about is that supply chain for that COTS technology runs through a handful of Asian countries. And, if you build your military infrastructure on stuff that's manufactured in Asia, how can you trust it?
Well, this is something that DIU actually confronted very directly because the world's largest drone manufacturer, DJI, is a Chinese company that has, probably north of 90% of the market share. And during the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, many American troops would literally just go out and buy a DJI drone and fly it because it provided better reconnaissance for their small tactical units than anything that they had access to otherwise. And this was a problem. And so one of the things that DIU did early was start a program called Rogue Squadron, the military's first commercial drone unit that we talk about in the book that really impressed Secretary Mattis when he became President Trump's first secretary, to do a couple things. One, to make DJI drones safe to be used by American forces. So even though they came from a potential adversary, the technology was walled off from being able to talk to anybody else. But more generally, just to experiment with what you could do with drones. And we were getting glimpses already in 2016 of what is now the world's first drone war in Ukraine.
Yeah. So there are a bunch of stories, but I'd like to start by asking you about Bob and Evelyn, who are two of my favorite characters. I'm sure they were your favorite characters by the time you were finished. You ran into these people inside. This was not inside the Pentagon. This was in Congress. And I got the sense that you were, Bob and Evelyn, who were two lower-level staff people who frustrated you guys early on. Can you tell that story? But I also got the sense that they might have been, I was wondering, you weren't really clear on it, I don't think, in the story, but I kept wondering who were Bob and Evelyn working for? I mean, whose interests were they defending? And I was wondering if you could sort of tell that story.
Sure, I'm happy to maybe start and then Chris can fill in. I think the whole thing was just like an education on how Washington really works, which I was maybe perhaps a bit naive to. So, my original plan too, when we were asked to do this job by Secretary Carter, was to take a kind of a valley approach. We'll go into stealth mode. We'll start working, we'll deliver some results, and then we'll make a bigger splash. That too is not how DoD works, right? He flew in his jet and had a big press conference. Day two, we get a call from a friend in the congressional staff that says, I've got some bad news. Roger, the DIU-X budget has been zeroized. I was like, I don't really know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. And it's worse than you think. It's not only is your budget zero, it is that it's with a pejorative nature such that the Pentagon can't move money around to fix it. And so this was going to happen in 3 months when the next bill was going to be passed. So quickly we go to Washington to try to solve it. We spend a bunch of time with folks on the Appropriations Committee, staffers. And what interesting turned out to be is that issues and gripes they had with the department that had nothing to do with us were behind it. So in particular, the Pentagon provides airlift for congressional delegations to go places. And for whatever reason, Secretary Carter's staff had denied a particular trip somewhere. And they were really upset about it. And they knew this was important to him. And so they said, look, we haven't gotten this delegation. And I said, look, the secretary doesn't work for me. I work for him, right? And so we realized, boy, this is there are factors here beyond us. And so what it really did, though, was say, okay, we have 3 months. We really need to put points on the board. We have to have tangible success to show that, hey, the Silicon Valley mindset of iterative development and speed has a real combat role. And so we came back and went into hyperdrive of trying to do that to solve. So it was a fascinating lesson for me, and maybe Chris can talk about the second half.
Well, what made matters worse is that we're flying to Washington. We've just been announced by the Secretary of Defense as being the next best thing since sliced bread, and on the airplane, we get these emails saying you need to use a different form of payment for your government rate hotel because your credit card has been cut. And sure enough, when Ash Carter relaunched the office, he took the chain that had administered some of its functions and moved it away and gave it to somebody else. And so rather than transfer our government credit cards, they just cut them. And so here we are, Raj's first trip to Capitol Hill, and we're paying with our personal credit cards, so you'll get yelled at by a bunch of staffers who are trying to kill our budget. It was insane.
Okay. So among the stories that you tell of certain of the DIX projects, there was a satellite project, I think it was called Capella. And I'm trying to figure out, when reading through it, it was really a striking story, which, ultimately there was a success down the road, but it was kind of a failure for DIX in the short run. Is that true? Is this a sort of something that worked out, but essentially you guys were blocked? Is that, this was this in the terms of the way the world is moving with drones and with the kind of surveillance technology. This is right at the heart of that. And you guys tried to do something. We're frustrated by the military-industrial complex, basically.
Sure. Maybe I'll start, and then I'll let Chris chime in on the Pentagon drama. One of the views that we were trying to work on is that, look, what is the commercial technology world, startup world, really good at? They're good at building software fast, because they have great engineers, and a model that builds it fast, iteratively. And second is low-cost hardware, right? That, again, every 3 years, like your phone, gets replaced, right? No one has unlikely anybody here has a 20-year-old cell phone on them. The military's traditional view is we're going to build amazing technology. It's exquisite, it's expensive, it takes a long time to build, but it's really good. Think an aircraft carrier, think a spy satellite the size of a Greyhound bus, billions of dollars to build, and when it's there, we have the best capability. This was before, again, how chips work. So one of the views was, instead of that Greyhound bus satellite, which we don't have a whole lot of and is now vulnerable to an adversary missile, let's build a constellation of a lot smaller satellites. They're cheaper, they go around. In today's world with Starlink, it seems obvious. But 10 years ago, not so much. And so we were working with a company to help solve the North Korea problem. So at the time, there was this issue that the North Koreans had these mobile missile launchers. They were moving them around the country, launching them over Japan, threatening the US, and it was a high priority. Can we go see these? Well, the Korean Peninsula has a lot of cloud cover, so you can't just take pictures of it. You needed this technology that was called a synthetic aperture radar, basically a radar from space that you can see what's on the ground. And instead of these, large billion-dollar-plus satellites, we had been looking for companies that could build small ones, that could, move quickly and build quickly. And we had found one of these in a company that was built by a couple of Stanford graduate students. One of them was the CEO of Pine was an immigrant from Iran, got his PhD, worked at NASA, and they had a really interesting technology, and we had the support of our leadership to go and work with them. And maybe I'll turn over the story now to Chris as to what happened after we got that charge.
So Capella had really astonishing technology, and it wasn't even that expensive. So we're talking about $50 million. And I can't tell you the last time, having worked in the Pentagon for 6 secretaries of defense, I've even been in a meeting where we're having a meeting about $50 million, right? The bar is usually a little bit higher. And we're having this volcanic disagreement with some people in the Pentagon who were of two views. There was a great skepticism that something that could be as important as a missile defeat mission, potentially detecting and stopping a nuclear launch, that you could trust something from the commercial sector to be a part of that chain. But we also ran into some pretty big politics. So at the very moment we were trying to get chunk change, through the Pentagon, a major spy satellite program that had been running years behind schedule and billions of dollars over budget was also up for reapproval. And a couple of the people in the Pentagon who were charged with getting that larger program back on track, said, you know what, we can't risk having this amazing new technology go forward right now. We have to wait a little bit because we don't want to get crosswise with the Hill and go through more trouble. And we tell the story in the book. It happened. It was an astonishing moment that does show you that sometimes you don't have the full freedom to maneuver.
I think you use the phrase in the book, military-industrial autoimmune system. Is that your phrase? Does it still exist?
You know, it does, but it's very different than it was, when we started. I think today there's a broad realization this technology is here, it's important. You can't go to you can't listen to any speech by a senior leader, uniformed or civilian in the Pentagon, and not hear about the impact of artificial intelligence, the impact of robotics and autonomy. We've seen now what drones are doing in Ukraine, what it did in Israel, how the Houthis are using them. So I think everyone understands, like, this is here to stay. I think the autoimmune now is, okay, we agree it's important. We don't have to worry about that. Now it's, what are the trade-offs? Because we don't have unlimited budget. So are we going to have one less aircraft carrier? Are we going to have one less squadron of jets? Are we going to have one less battalion of troops? Like, what are the trade-offs for this capabilities? And those are hard because you've grown up in a world for a couple of decades that's different.
Yeah. There's another story. It revolves around this $1 billion retrofit of a command and control center that was being led by Northrop Grumman. And you guys basically came face to face with Northrop Grumman. And I was trying to sort that out. I mean, you were threatening $1 billion contract that had basically delivered nothing. With what? You sent some hackers into the Middle East to redesign a bit of software and and replace basically a whiteboard that was doing logistics or something like that. And it was kind of a remarkable story. Did it have a good resolution in the end?
It did, yeah, and I'll tell the story in an efficient way, and I think it also shows, again, one of the heroes that are out there. So I think it was 2016. I go and visit the Combined Air Operations Center. This is the facility in Qatar that runs all of our air operations in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq. It's probably a room, I don't know, 4 times the size of the one we're sitting in here. Lots of screens, but honestly, no technology had limited upgrades since when I had been in uniform there like a decade before, right? Excel and PowerPoint was still how we fought the war. One of the things we saw is this place that does planning of air refueling tankers. So big jumbo jets giving gas to fighter jets. They were doing it using a whiteboard, magnetic pucks, dry erase markers, and someone on an Excel sheet. It took about 50 man-hours a day to make the plan, and then they would send that plan out to all the units. And so we said, boy, this is something that we can do. We were there with the Defense Innovation Board. This is an example. So I called one of the heroes in this book, this guy named Enrique Odi. He was a colonel in the U.S. Air Force at the time. And he had this vision for like the modern system for how the military did cloud and cloud computing. That was a big, that's a big enchilada to go after, and very hard to get going. But so I called him that evening. I said, Enrique, we got the right project for you to start. I need you to find 6 engineers and get them on a plane to Qatar the next day. So we found 3 Air Force engineers and 3 long-haired folks here from the Valley, and put them on a plane. And so they get out there. We were able to get them secret clearances, despite maybe some of drug use of some of these folks in previous times. We got them authorities to take a Macintosh into the government facility. Like, no one brings that, but like, these guys aren't going to code on Windows 95. And, so these guys start coding. 2 months later, they have a prototype that works. And basically, as you could imagine, it's a traveling salesman program. A problem, you hit the button and it created the plan in, I don't know, a minute. And then they spent an hour quality controlling it. Interesting, maybe not the most amazing thing, but what we discovered was what was happening at that time is a lot of our American troops and our allied troops would come under fire from insurgents. They called it troops in contact. The first thing you do is you'll send fighters and other people to help support them. Well, those fighters drink a lot of gas, so then you have to set a tanker. But if the plan takes 50 hours to do, you can't redo it. So they had tankers on alert in different parts of the region. And that would happen. They'd scramble it. The guys would run to the jet and they'd take off and go there. What we discovered was that because you could now reform the plan, you didn't have to have any scrambles. It saved 3 scrambles a day. Each scramble costs about $250,000. The tool cost $2 million. The thing paid for itself in like 4 days. Monumental change. You can go through the book in terms of like the rest of the story and how John McCain got involved. But what it did do was kick off the first software factory for the Air Force, where you had Air Force uniformed airmen using software and were dedicated to building software and valuing that. And Enrique became the first commander of this unit. It was called Kessel Run. It continues today, and it's based in Boston.
Nice. So that's a victory.
It's a victory, and now there's multiple ones of these in the Space Force and the Navy. Again, the value of software.
Yeah. So the book is part narrative, part biography, but it's also a bit of a manifesto. And there's one component that I'm struggling with, and we got to have this out, because you make a case for what you call military-civil fusion. Mm-hmm. Okay, narrowly, let me read your points. Mandatory national service, reopen military bases, expand ROTC, put it back on campuses, fix military career paths, fix our immigration system, which is a separate conversation we should have. And then you say, place orders, don't give orders. So those are very narrow things. And you try to distinguish this notion of military fusion in America from what it looks like in China.
Yep.
Where you have a very top-down. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, okay, I can live with all of those points that you've got. But that's within one framework where we have America traditionally doesn't have an authoritarian government. But if America had an authoritarian government, military-civil fusion might look very different.
It would.
Are you aware of the?
Sure. So I think, look, as we think about, I think the greatest threat to our generation is the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism and their adventurism. You've seen what we've had, Ukraine being the example there. And if as we argue and we believe, if we think that the country or allied group that will be most powerful will be the one that understands, operationalizes, and ingests commercial technology like AI and drones, you have to go where that source is, which is the commercial world, right? So how do you bring those worlds together? You could do it like authoritarians, like the CCP has done, which is I'm going to have a CCP member in every company's board, and when I need the production to move to support the PLA versus commercial world, you can do that. Well, that's not the American way, right? Or they steal IP from one company and send it to another. We don't do that, right? So how do you encourage these two worlds to come together, yet still preserve our liberal democratic values? Well, it's, I would say it's 2 or 3 things. It's the power of the purse, so write contracts. How do you engage with companies and make it a business sense? That's happening. DIU now has $1 billion to go buy drones with. But the second is the human piece of it, right? Again, all of these organizations are not nameless, faceless places. Like, there's people in them. And so how do you build those bonds together? How do you get people to work with people that are different than themselves, that are in different walks of life? And I think, this is where the national missions, the service, the rebuilding bases, how do we do it yet not lose our American way?
Yeah. And let's flip the coin. And I want to ask you guys a little bit about China. I was in China in 2016 in the third ring in Beijing. And, Peter Thiel was, under Trump, he was very clear about saying the Chinese are stealing technology from America. They're not innovating. They get their technology. But when I was in Beijing, what I saw that they stole from the United States was the Silicon Valley way of doing things. And now, Xi has shut that down almost entirely, I think, in the interim since I was there. But I wonder if you think, what your sense is about China as an innovation economy. Do you have a view of whether they can compete with us as an authoritarian?
So going back to that drone company, DJI, I mean, it's this incredible story of the American failure to commercialize and not to capitalize on inexpensive supply chains. So the people that actually invent the operating system to fly drones are a bunch of MIT grad students in about 2001. So we actually invented drones in the United States. Who commercialized it? China. Now, with DJI, you actually saw the same debate play out. Oh, they're just taking, GoPro's technology and making it a little bit better. No, they had, I think, over 1,200 PhD level research and developers making what quickly became the best drone products in the world. So this is an economy that's innovating. It's a military also that's innovating. And I think we ignore that, both in economic and military terms, at our peril.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, I think to further on to your point, John, you would think that they should have the advantage in AI, right? They have all the data they need, right? The idea of data privacy doesn't really exist there. So lots of data. They have lots of researchers, more engineers than here. There's more AI papers per year built in China than here. And they're putting a lot of money into it, government money, far more than we are. Yet I don't think there are any real credible large language models coming out of China right now, right? It's all here. And so why is that? I think it's, again, the free flow of talent, the free flow of capital really does allow these sparks of innovation to grow. So we have the natural advantage, and we have friends, we have allies, right? I'd rather have South Korea and Japan and UK as our friends than North Korea or Iran. And I think again, doubling down on what's made it work for this Western liberal democracies, capitalism and allyship is how we meet and exceed this threat and keep the peace.
Both of you guys are sort of you left DIU, DUIX, became DIU. You're both sort of re-engaged now. Are you both still active as advisors in the?
Yeah, I became a special government employee, an unpaid employee. So I go down and help out about one day a month. And it's so gratifying to walk into that building and see what's going on there. My favorite place in that building, that its current leader, Doug Beck, who's a great mentor to both Raj and me, walked us right back to. And it's the photograph of Secretary Carter on the day that he announced our new leadership team talking to the team. And you can see Raj and me and actually Doug in the photograph. So there's some amazing things happening now at DIU. It's really grown, and it's right now at the forefront of the most important technological initiative in the Department of Defense, the Replicator Initiative.
So I wanted to ask about Replicator. First of all, would you describe what Replicator is? And it's certainly the model that you guys were trying to create is what Replicator is, but is there a direct linkage between what DIU did and what Replicator is?
So Replicator is the idea that we can't wait for the next generation fighter to come along after the F-35, even though Raj would really want to fly it if he got a chance. We have to move much more quickly and actually go to war with autonomous systems. That's clearly where war is going. And so the Replicator Initiative is an attempt to build at some significant scale autonomous drones in the air and also at sea. And DIU is in the lead of helping to devise a way for the Pentagon, again, to access low-cost and rapid software-driven, hardware-driven innovation, with the idea being that is going to have to be the way that we don't build another F-35.
Yeah. So that pulls us into the discussion of AI. And it's like 14 different directions we can go in. But first, you talked about autonomous weapons. It is still the U.S. policy that was laid out in 2012. I think it's a directive in the Pentagon called 3009 that decrees that a human should be in the loop. Is that still the case?
That is still the case.
Are we kidding ourselves? I mean, I'm looking at what's happening in Ukraine. Well, let's start. You guys are probably both familiar with a video that was created by a Berkeley computer science professor who was here not long ago, Stuart Russell, called Slaughterbots, about what can go wrong. Mm-hmm. I was poking around yesterday looking at stuff, and I discovered a video made by an Israeli defense company called Elbit, which was exactly the same video that I saw him do, except it was a product description. It wasn't science fiction. So this was about an autonomous drone system that a tactical group could use to go into buildings and basically kill people. And what I found fascinating about this video is in every scene when the drone killed some terrorist, there was a scene where it flashed back to the control room and they pushed a button. So they were trying to make the case the human was still in the loop. I don't see how that's possible to keep the humans in the loop given the speed of this kind of warfare.
Look, it's a really challenging topic, and I don't think we have the answers. The war is a terrible thing, right? And so ideally we just deter it and not actually have it. But if we do have it, you want to minimize the amount of death. And I think the decision to use lethal force is a very serious one. And if we don't really understand fully yet today of how some of these decisions are made, having a human in the loop is important. And again, we think about it as the American way of war. How we fight and are trying to adhere as best we can to the Geneva Conventions is different than what our adversaries do, right? It's different than what we're seeing in the battlefield of Ukraine today. So, but if our adversaries don't have some of those restrictions and functions, how do we stay true to our values yet continue to deter? And I don't know if we know the answer to that. And those things occur, every time some new technology is. But again, I think long term we win by staying true to ourselves. But as we think about, again, AI and the uses of it, of course, the Slaughterbots style videos, very interesting. They make good videos. But really, the real power of AI in the near term will be cutting through what is called the fog of war. How do you know where the good guys are? How do you know where the bad guys are? How do you know what they're doing? And how do you make good decisions? And cutting through that noise, understanding really what's happening and doing it at the speed, right? Things are moving fast. This is where AI can be really, really valuable. And I think those are the places that we can start.
Decision making. Chris, a couple times I've seen you in the last week refer to the reality that the U.S. had to pull M1 techs back from the front line because they were vulnerable to drones. And I was thinking about all of this technology that's gone into this war, this proxy war, whatever we're having, and it seems like it's a stalemate. So there's all this new technology, and we seem to be right back in World War I, where we're sort of fighting like trench warfare. I mean, the technology hasn't led to one side dominating. So what's going on?
Well, the way we talk about this in the book is this notion of sort of hybrid war. So it is true. In Ukraine, you have trench warfare, you have mechanized warfare, you have tanks, you have artillery exchanges, but you also have a whole system of commercial technology that's a digital layer, if you will, around those traditional weapon systems. So you now have the Ukrainian military running its command and control off Starlink and smartphone encrypted apps. You have incredibly inexpensive drones playing a hugely consequential role on the battlefield. And just to spell it for this audience, the M1A1 tank story, this is the most advanced battle tank in the world. And we sent 31 to Ukraine. And Ukraine has just had to evacuate them from the front because 7 of them, a quarter of them, were killed by Russian kamikaze drones. And if you're, a person with a little knowledge of paradigm shifts in warfare, this sure looks like the beginning of the end of man-mechanized warfare, which began with tanks in the First World War. And so if we're seeing that, then that's a problem for militaries like ours that have made a lot of investments in tanks, because it turns out what we have, in the supply garage in the back might not be any good at fighting war anymore.
Well, so, let's talk about China a little bit. Wars that aren't happening and probably shouldn't happen. A lot of discussion about the role of aircraft carriers going forward in the future. You guys developed, invested in a technology called Saildrone. It's a remarkable autonomous seagoing vehicle. It's a surveillance platform. It's not a weapon platform. But I guess the question it's a broader question. People have begun to have this discussion about whether this is the Oppenheimer moment for artificial intelligence, or is it the Dr. Strangelove moment for artificial intelligence? Because, Dr. Strangelove talked about automated systems way back then. We're rushing to develop AI. Have you guys given up on the ability, the possibility of there was this UN treaty activity around artificial intelligence. Is that dead in the water?
it's a complicated story of how we're going to shift, and I'll tie the two together, right? So if we think again about exquisite systems, we have aircraft carriers. Well, the adversaries have created new types of missiles and weapons that perhaps those things might not be survivable, right? You have 5,000 individuals in a very small piece of area. So what do you do instead? How do you do ubiquitous small drones that are unmanned? And is it better? Is it in our national interest to send machines instead of humans, right? If you're the parent of one of these, you'd probably say yes. And so then we're going to do trade-offs. Okay, we're going to have 2 less aircraft carriers. We're going to have 30,000 more of these drones, and because of that. But then it goes to your question now. Okay, how do you control that? Is it a balance? Is it an imbalance? And it's hard to say. Dr. Strangelove versus other movies. But the way I think about it is, we want to build and show that there is credible overmatch in our capability, right? We don't want to ever have a fair fight. And the history of conflict shows that it's technology that often is the prevailing factor. And so we want to be multiple steps ahead of any adversary, that our men and women in uniform will never fight a fair fight, and it deters our enemies.
Which brings us to, I think it was Ash Carter who proposed this notion, or who was building what he called the third offset. This is the technological advantage that you talk about that the U.S. had for so long. Is the third offset idea still alive? And
very much so. So that's something that Deputy Secretary Bob Work led in a very classified way around the time that DIU was getting started. And it was a look by people on the E-Ring, very senior people in the military, at how quickly the ground was shifting around us, and how essentially a generation of investments in incredible precision strike weapons were now being equaled by our adversaries. Or even bettered by our adversaries in cases. And the U.S. now needed to go out and search for a whole new paradigm of weapon systems if it wanted to have the degree of overmatch that we all watched as a society in the first Gulf War, where all of a sudden we're dropping bombs down chimneys, right? Something that nobody had ever been able to do before. So the third offset is very much still a part of the conversation. If you're a strategist like me, you got to change the words every year, so we don't call it third offset. But that conversation about crisis and overmatch and new paradigms of technology is very alive and well. Yeah.
John, that's how initiatives survive in a bureaucracy. You want the next leader to own it by naming it. So it's alive in some other name, just like this organization's name changed.
Great.
Yeah,
we have some audience questions, but I do want to ask, push a little bit more on that question about, I guess, arms races, because I think there are weapon systems that are stabilizing, and there are weapon systems that are technologies that are stabilizing, and there are technologies that are destabilizing. I worry that because of the rapidity of warfare, that AI may become a destabilizing technology, and that in getting into an arms race, that would not be, it would lead us toward war rather than leading us toward a more stable world.
Well, this is one of the great questions, and one of the fascinating bits of political science to come out of the Cold War was the fact that the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the world actually lowered the risk of great power war, because nobody actually wanted to get in a nuclear exchange. Now, did other awful things happen in the world? Absolutely. Would you want everybody in the world to have a nuclear weapon? Most certainly not. But I think it's too early to know where AI is going to fall on the spectrum. But it's something that we should all be extremely alert to.
Yeah. I mean, that's how we won the Cold War too, right? From the economic side of overspending.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be good if we could engage in an economic war with China rather than a military war?
Exactly. And again, it plays to our strengths of innovation and growth.
Yeah. So we have audience questions. The first one is, this is to Raj. What insights did you take away from DIU that you are applying now as a VC at Shield Capital? And we'll start with that one.
Well, look, I think taking these new technologies and experimenting with them and figuring out how it's going to apply to national security use cases along with commercial ones. There's a great ecosystem of investment dollars and entrepreneurs and customers. When Chris and I had first started, there was hardly any real funding going to companies focused on that. And we've seen a real sea change. I think last year was like $7 billion went to national security oriented companies. I think this is a great thing, right? And more importantly than just the dollars, you're seeing really smart engineers that say, I'm seeing what happened in Israel. I'm seeing what happened in Ukraine, and I just can't take the way of life we have for granted. And instead of building a photo sharing app, I'm going to build something that helps preserve this piece. So I think it's a wonderful trend. I hope we keep it going, and I'm glad now that in the private sector to get to play a small role in it.
And then there's a follow-up question. How do you see the defense tech ecosystem under a Trump administration versus Biden?
I'm going to steal one of Chris's lines here, but look, the next president will have some serious choices to make in terms of how much do we double down on these new technologies and new approaches. Are we going? How aggressive will they be in changing the bureaucracy? Right. So Chris talked about Replicator, which is again I think a fantastic program. It's about $1 billion. Pentagon budget is $800 billion. Okay, so if we really believe that this AI is going to be important, should we spend 1%, 10%? So I think these are the types of choices that the next president's going to have to make.
Let's see. To both of you, do you think the DoD should spend more on R&D in addition to working more with Silicon Valley?
Yes. And the reason why is that our tech economy is our greatest national advantage. It's something that no other country in the world has. It is true that there are other countries that are way better at supply chains and low cost manufacturing than we are, but so far our AI is a lot better, right? So absolutely, from a national perspective, this is the best way to mobilize the best resources our nation has for our security.
In addition to more, are there places that particularly deserve more? I mean, are new areas of R&D?
I mean, we talk about this in the book. For the cost of a single aircraft carrier, you can purchase, I think, 17,000 sail drones. Similarly, I think for the cost of an aircraft carrier, you could literally give each of the United States' 54 treaty allies that we're obligated to defend, we could blanket them with Starlinks, right? So we are starting to face some of these fundamental questions of where should the Pentagon's resource dollars go. And as we found out through hard experience in the Pentagon, it's sometimes very difficult to turn off programs that, by any measure, don't make sense any longer.
Yeah. I want to ask you, I mean, there's the sail drone approach. I mean, you can get a lot of sail drones and they can see the whole world, but they can't really kill anything. I mean, as they're just small little platforms that sail around. But we do have a weapon system that's now in the inventory that is supposed to protect our aircraft carriers by letting them project power when they're farther away. It's called the Long Range Advanced Ship Missile. And are you aware of, I mean, has it changed the equation in the way we use aircraft carriers?
I think that the greatest threat that most naval strategists worry the most about are going to be the advent of hypersonic missiles. And, a LRASM, as it's called, is an incredible technology. It is like a BB, compared to a 50 caliber round that would be a hypersonic weapon. And, if hypersonic weapons, they're not there yet, but if they really do come along in number, then you are not going to be able to put a Navy service combatant anywhere near one of our advanced adversaries.
Yeah. What will it take to give battalion commanders discretionary budget to let their forces buy and try unit-level tech and services?
That's a really interesting question, right? How decentralized do we need to be in this? Like, what level of experimentation? And it's not that easy to answer where okay, every battalion will, have a budget, buy your own stuff commercially and try it, because people rotate, they need to work interoperably, right? That's really one of the greater inventions of the U.S. military, is that, I could, as a pilot, I could go from one squadron on the side of the world to another one, and the standards and the tactics, the training, the equipment were all interchangeable. On the other hand, if we centralize all of innovation, that also can be stifling. So we have to balance that. I think what we've seen in the past is there are certain units, particularly in our run by the special operations groups, that are more nimble. They all try that. So I think what we see is they try it, they understand what works, what doesn't work, and then push it out. And that actually is working quite well. I think the challenge is now, what's the cycle time once they figure out something that works? Do we have to wait 2 years, 10 years for it to get fielded, or can we do it more quickly?
And have you, it's been a decade. Is there a meaningful shift in rate of deployment? So Replicator is going to be a good test, right? If we can, Replicator has some dates that are like next year, doesn't it, to get products into the field?
It's sort of, causing a lot of heads on the earring to turn. What do you mean we don't have 10 years to get the right answer?
Yeah.
But one of the most impressive and recent developments is actually in the Air Force, where the sitting Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, is starting the Combat Collaborative Aircraft Program, which is a program to bring 10,000 drones and have them fight alongside our manned fighters. And the two companies that are now in the final stage of that competition, one is Anduril, a new entrant, and the other is a non-traditional performer, General Atomics. So things are beginning to shift.
And that decision will be made how quickly? So that contract will know about whether non-traditional guys can play very soon?
It's an initiative that started, Raj, 2 years ago?
They've already down selected to those two. So it will be one of those two. It's already happened.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big deal.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm not quite sure I understand this one. How have the shifts in the administration impacted the project approaches to innovation?
So we had the interesting experience of being there for the transition. So we, at least in our tenure, spent a year under Secretary Carter and then a year under Secretary Mattis. What I'd tell you is that there was really not much change between the two. I think it's a very bipartisan view that we need a strong national defense and that innovation is inextricably linked. Secretary Mattis renamed it, dropped the X, so that was great. But a whole new cast of characters, both on the Hill and in the Pentagon, have continued that. I think you've seen that transition now to Secretary Austin and President Biden. It's continued. So I think this is a bipartisan effort.
Yeah. You guys were pretty harsh on the Google engineers who didn't want to work on Project Maven. I think you might have called them un-American a little bit, but things have changed. Ukraine changed a lot of minds in the Valley. It turns out people think there are good wars and there are bad wars, and so even people who wanted to work on things that went under Christmas trees have changed their minds. But it doesn't. And this gets me back to this military-civil fusion thing. We're not in a command and control economy. There are engineers who should not have to work on military stuff. You should. This takes us into Eisenhower territory. I think that beware the military-industrial complex. You should have a civilian economy that is. That's what America is about, isn't it?
So maybe you want to talk about some of the stuff that happened in Ukraine. I'll tell some Maven stories.
I will just, right after I moved out here to work with Raj at DIU, a friend had me over for dinner, and he wanted to introduce me to his friend set, and a bunch of them were actually funders of the Stuart Russell Stop Killer Robots campaign. So you can imagine how that dinner went for me. It was not a nice way to meet people. So fast forward a few years later, and my friend Matt says, we just had the invasion of Ukraine kick off last week. My friends are extremely distraught. They want to get together tonight to talk about what's happening. And it was astonishing to go around the table there. So many of these people are of European descent, had lived in Europe. And they spent all night asking me about the difference between U.S. and British anti-tank systems. So, security, and I understand it. Like, war is an awful thing. I really understand why it is that some people in Silicon Valley are the view they want nothing to do with it. But security is there until it isn't, and you never want to be in a country where it goes away.
Yeah. We have just a little bit more time. What are the best and worst case scenarios for adoption of AI in the military and defense? That's a tough one.
I think the best case, if you go back to the cover of Unit X, you have an iPhone. We all like our new iPhones. I can't wait to go and buy my iPhone 16, even though I'm going to get in trouble on the home front for that. We want that system of production, right, which updates things every year to be in the driver's seat on AI. We don't want to have to wait 15 years for a new system to come online. I think that would be the best and the worst.
Yeah. I think that's all we have time for today. Raj Shah, Christopher Kirchhoff, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your insight and behind-the-scenes expertise. Thank you also to you, our audience. You can get your hands on a copy of Raj and Christopher's book, Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War, here or at your local bookstore. Now, Raj and Christopher will be signing your new copy in the lounge in just a moment. If you would like to engage in future programs or support Commonwealth Club World Affairs, please visit the website at www.commonwealth.org. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, John.